Once was a swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of the coolabah tree, as he watched and waited till his billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Lukes here at the Crossroads. Interesting subject for today. The individual. Why the individual? Well, let's find out. We've got our guests in the forum, and I'd like to bring them to your attention. Our first guest for a local Adelaide lady, Betty Lukes. Welcome, Betty Lukes.
Oh, good morning, Arnis.
Yeah, good morning. And from Canada, Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace. Thank you. No worries.
Pleased to be here.
Okay, pleased to have you too, Wallace. All right, now the history of common law rights: innocent till proven guilty. Habeas corpus: you can't have a trial without producing the body. Magna Carta: inherent rights are vested in the individual, that even the king is subject to law. These are quite profound institutions. These are quite profound outcomes of deep thinking over history. And I'm of the view that we alter them at our peril. Now the group identity, this group identity that's being presented by the activists, the political activists of today, group identity, they put you in groups and then they polarise, cause you to fight each other. Whether it's feminists and the supposed patriarchal male, conceptions of a view of reality that's not necessarily founded on truth. You group someone and then you blame them or challenge them or brand them under this group. You are this, you're a male, therefore you're patriarchal, therefore you're this, you're dominant, you're cruel, you're exploitive. Everything that men can do wrong is presented in a group form, and of course it's incorrect, because common law rights present it that as an individual you can break the law. As an individual you can breach a trust, as we've seen demonstrated politically. In families you can breach a trust. You don't collectively brand all males in a family because of things. So we need to understand why the individual is most important, and I think it comes back, as I understand it, it comes back from Christian teaching. When Jesus talks about power and authority, when he talks about the kingdom, he presents it that the kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom of God is within you. It is an opportunity of expression that presents it that there is a divine spark inside you, every single individual. Now, Peterson presents it that this divine spark is an opportunity to actually go out and slay the dragon. If you're of a mind to go out after things of value, intrinsic value that's worth going out after, it's always on the basis of the individual. It's never the group. Activists, if they do wrong, it's one at a time is doing wrong. It's not a group of political people. So when you assess, I remember a previous lecture that I happened to stand in front of a rostrum over. I presented an image of a young girl with a megaphone, and she was opposed to a particular point of view, and she was using this megaphone to present her case. And I'm of the view, two things. One is that you can't paint her with the same brush as every other activist. You've got to actually look at her as an individual and see if there's an opportunity to reason and discuss and talk with, and if there is, then pursue it. She's not necessarily the enemy. And the other is, of course, is that as an activist, it's especially a Marxist activist or a fascist activist or whatever, you have a preconceived view of everything based on a dogma, without necessarily thinking, but you just cut back to well, they're this or they're that, and therefore this is my position. And so it's very wrong. It's very wrong. That's why clear thinking is most important, and this is my opening salvo for today. I'd like to welcome Wallace from Canada. Wallace, I've just said a quick hello, and I present the floor to you to continue on. Wallace.
Well, I'm reminded of Douglas's, C.H. Douglas's statement that the group is an atavism from which the individual hopes to emerge. You lose your individuality in the group. You are commandeered to serve the purposes and ideals of the group. But that abstracts those things from you as an individual. You lose your individuality, and in that way you become unpersoned. You become an agent of whoever controls the group, because every group is controlled by someone. It doesn't just control itself. The group in itself is just an abstraction. There has to be some kind of a very definite line of authority and administration within the group. And if you're brought into that, you lose your freedom. Now you have to assume that either we live according to natural law or we'll live according to imposed regulations, according to somebody's concept as to how things should be rather than how they are. So this is a very different, the two views are very, very different, and they lead to very, very different results. In one case, they lead to maximizing the freedom of the individual. In the other case, it leads to the restriction of the individual on the alleged value of some ideal. And of course, if from the Marxist standpoint, it's a question of assuming that human relationships are exploitative, and the society has to be changed in order to eliminate this exploitive nature that is supposed to be intrinsic to it.
Thank you, Wallace. And it's an interesting salvo coming from you, and also pointing out that, yes, in groups you lose your identity, you lose your opportunity for self-expression, and rather you take on the expression of the group based on someone else's point of view as to what that reality ought to be, not actually how reality is. Betty Lukes, your thoughts, please.
While Wally was speaking, I was thinking of the story that a former, or the late Ted Rock, a wonderful social creditor, related about his experiences in the Australian Army during World War II. What happened during the World War II is that I guess it was the Army education section, and they were promoting communism, blatantly promoting communism. And Ted was enticed towards these ideas, but he had one thought that worried him, and it was, now what if I don't agree with it? What do you do? And you know what the answer was from the tutor? We would shoot you. That was the answer. In other words, either you agree with us or we'll destroy you. And it seems to me that you can see that everywhere now, whether it's in the education system or politics, the individual counts for nothing. It's the group, and this is so wrong. And that's why we see such a mess around us. Why we see such chaos around us, and why the young don't are not at peace within themselves, from what I can see, because their natural inclinations are smothered. Their desire to express themselves, their own individuality, their own personality, their own beliefs, and to discuss them. All of these are suppressed because it is the dominant philosophy that is being imposed upon them. And I think that...
Thanks, Betty. I've jumped in. I've just jumped in front of you. I'm sorry for that, but as soon as I jump away from you, I'll lose your audio. Philosophy. Why is philosophy so important? Why is it that in the education system they're stifling individual initiative, but rather indoctrinating conformity to an ideology that's foreign to what our culture has adopted. And bear in mind that if you change the if you like, the dominant philosophy, you go to a foreign philosophy. All those institutions that you built up over, in our case, millennia, or even greater than millennia, those institutions have been hard fought for. We think of, say, trial by jury. Why is it trial by jury? Why not trial by combat? I mean, we see trial by combat every day with the American invasion of another nation. It's trial by combat. We're going to win. We're going to base it on strength, not negotiation, not equal representation, not on a fair discussion and pursuit of truth, but rather trial by combat. I find it absurd, abhorrent really, because it's so destructive. Whereas the trial by jury is that not only do you have a majority in the jury to determine innocent till proven guilty, but you've got to have almost a complete mandate from it. I believe it's got to be at least 10, if not 11. And more serious crimes, it's got to be almost unanimous. So these things are quite important. These institutions took thousands of years to develop, and we throw them out to our peril. You know, you have commissars. The Soviets demonstrated it, the Chinese, the Inquisition, Spanish. It's there. You have commissars who choose whether you're right or wrong. They choose your guilt and then just determine the punishment. It's if you're up, you're already proven guilty because you've been charged. That's the end of it. Whereas our systems say, no, this is a creature of God, unique individual, and you've got to prove beyond reasonable doubt, not just the judge, unless you choose the judge, but you've got to prove it to a jury of their own peers. And so it puts the value of that individual up on a pedestal, that this system of law has to be based on that, and you can't deviate from that. You have no right to, and that's why these 18C or C16 in Canada, 18C in Australia, these commissars, these supposedly rights commissars, are you're guilty. The fact that you're charged, you're guilty, and the process of standing before them is the punishment. Even if the punishment is a fine in the end after years and years of protraction, the fact is you're guilty, and the process we will bankrupt you, we will destroy you intellectually and put pressure on you, and so it is foreign to us. It's foreign to our system, our institutions. It's foreign to us. So I think this is most important. Now I'm going to bring it back to Wallace and see if you can take us a bit further on this, the individual, please, Wallace.
Well, it's a very sophisticated form of psychological conditioning or warfare that we are going through. The people who seek power do understand certain frailties and weaknesses within humans, and they try to actually gloss over the truth in order to increase their power over the individual by denying him information which would make him resistant to mere edict. And the individual tends to be inquiring, but there's a tendency today to condemn anyone for saying the simplest thing. And they have conditioned people to a large extent because so many people say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And they back down when they shouldn't. When they, like Peterson has said, I am not going to back down under this kind of an assault. I am going to stand up and think and express myself, because I'm going to seek the truth.
Excellent. That's very good.
When you assume that there is no natural law pervading the universe, and that it's up to you through your intellect, your superior mental powers, to shape society, then you are not going to be tolerant of people because you have the truth. And you, by the virtue of the fact that you have the truth, you have the authority to force them into a particular pattern of compliance and behavior. It's a very, very dangerous thing, and it has led to tyranny.
Okay, thank you for that, Wallace. I see you've touched on something that's we've previously discussed today outside of the forum, and that is the uniqueness of the individual. That we can't be in a group, and I know that this is very dear to Betty's heart. Betty, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Arnie. Listening to Wallace, it just reminded me, thinking of this country that I live in. We're a very young country in terms of nations, very young, and it's a harsh land in certain places, very harsh, and I just have such admiration for the pioneers who went before us. And they had to have been individuals of strong resilience to have even survived, let alone to have pioneered the land, to have felled the trees and dug the ground and built their tin sheds or their log huts, whatever. They couldn't have. It wasn't a group that did these things. It was the character of the people who did it, and they still would have had their sense of individuality and freedom and pride. They certainly would have, if they were convicts, they would have had a great resentment to the system that sent them here. But from my understanding, they were the backbone of this country.
Thanks, Betty. There was another part that I'm going to bring you back up in a sec, and there was another part to this story, and that is you talk about people who you know who are identical twins and also twins within your family, and etc. So I'm going to put it back to you to keep going on this.
Well, in my understanding, there are no two people who are exactly alike. We are all distinct human beings. Not only are we so distinct, we don't have the same fingerprints. I know of a set of identical twins. They'd be older men now, of course, and they look alike, and you could mistake one for the other if you didn't know them personally. But you only have to talk to them, and you see the difference immediately. Their personalities are not the same. They're identical twins, remember. And their careers are different. What they've done in life is different. And this is a most important point, that not even identical twins are exactly the same.
Thanks for that, Betty. That is true, and very important, because when you assess anyone, when you look at them for whatever reason, whether it's a friendship or something deeper, or just an association, a work colleague, it's on the basis that what you're going to not differentiate. In fact, we do. We discriminate every day. Even picking an apple from the supermarket, we discriminate against all those other apples because of how this apple looks to you. And so it is with people. If you think you're going to work alongside someone, you've got to weigh up, can we get on? Let alone someone for a deep friendship, and especially, of course, when you start talking about long-term relationships, how vital it is that you discriminate. You actually look at them and see, who is this individual. Now I'm going to go to Wallace now, because I see both hands are up, but Wallace would like the floor. So Wallace, you've got the floor.
Well, let's face it, discrimination is the ability to differentiate. And if you don't have the ability to differentiate, you are rendered virtually ineffective. You cannot live in the world. You cannot function in the world unless you have the ability to discriminate. It's the whole basis of survival and progress. But discrimination should be within the context of human relations where everybody benefits from it. You know, if you have a preconceived idea of how the world should be, and you've taken upon yourself to impose that upon the world, then individuality has to be crushed. It will be branded as being antisocial. It will be contrary to party policy. It's simply destructive. I mean, I came that you would have life and life more abundant. How can you have a life more abundant when you are restricted on pure ideology, which doesn't necessarily coincide with natural law or the nature of things?
Thanks, Wallace. And that's very important too. You've touched on natural law, and this is where, if we're going to attempt to design a system, a purpose behind it has got to be that, well, what works, what doesn't work, rather than it ought to work. But you've got to look at what actually does work, and I think that's most important. Now, Betty, you had your hand up to continue on this, and I'm going to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnie. I have to admit I was amused when I heard you fellows talking about discrimination. It just reminded me that Jordan Peterson, in his psychological study of human relationships, he points out that it is the woman who chooses her mate, and not the man. I get the idea that the male could choose between, well, is happy to choose one or the other, whereas the woman, it seems to me, is the one who discriminates more than the male. And that just amused me, because he did say that, that males are actually frightened of females. I thought, good, we'll have to do that a bit more often.
Very good point. Very good point. And I know exactly what you mean. And I found Peterson a huge learning opportunity. In my younger days, I studied. When I say studied, I read several books by a bloke called James Dobson, an American psychologist, and it helped me raise my children and understand my children. And the fact is that you don't turn an adult, have children, and then all of a sudden it's you're automatically you know what you're doing. You don't. And I've had to pursue knowledge in order to raise my family, and so far so good. They're turning out okay, but it's not something that you actually stop doing as a parent. You continue on, because I notice that I look at my mother and I know that she guides me in a lot of ways, and there I am with my children doing the same thing, and hopefully them with the grandchildren. So yes, discrimination is really important, and of course this comes back to the individual. You can't collectively group people. You've got to actually treat them or look at them one at a time, and on the basis of that assess who they are and how you're going to treat them, how you're going to interact. So yes, discrimination of the individual is important. Wallace, back to you.
Well, after this exchange, I feel very discriminated against. I feel treated unfairly, and I think I'm going to join a masculinist organization. Because after all, why shouldn't I be able to choose whoever I wanted as a mate? Can you feature yourself getting up before the nation, as our Prime Minister did, and saying, I'm a feminist, I've always been a feminist, and I will always be a feminist? Well, I can't feature myself getting up before the nation and saying, I'm a masculinist, and I've always been a masculinist, and I always will be a masculinist. I think I would be destroyed. I mean, it's insanity. I mean, it completely separates the relationship between men and women. It makes them appear to be at odds with each other instead of be a mutual support to each other. It's very unnatural. It seems to be totally unhealthy, unnatural, and frankly destructive. It's a divisive factor.
Okay, thanks, Wallace. Now that's in the subject matter is the individual, and I know that I've drawn us off to talk about discrimination. but the discrimination is in a sense an assistance to identify the uniqueness of the individual. And I know that the is it C16, the bill, genderism, gender identity, grouping people. I'm a this, I'm a that. Well, actually, I'm not anymore. I'm something new, and I've just came up with that today, and I find that extraordinary that you can self-identify on a daily basis, and then again, even discriminating based on a daily basis. How dare you? Why not by the second? That I'm at this moment in time, I'm this. Hang on, I'm now that. Hang on, I'm now that. Hang on, It's like a broken record. What are you? You're all over the place. Hang on. Stay there. I'm just about to. I'm just a bit concerned about your subject on that, Wallace. I'm going to think about it a little bit before I give you the floor. Okay, Betty, back to you.
Well, I look at it from the point of view, I look at every human being that I come in contact with, and if I get to know them better, I look at what's inside them. I do my best to give them the respect and the dignity that they are entitled to as a human being with a soul, and we are fellow human beings in that sense. But of course I do discriminate in doing my best to understand their nature, their character.
That's it. Thank you, Nana. Thank you, Betty. Now I'm just going to, okay, we've looked at discrimination. That's essentially identifying the unique characteristics of an individual. But we've got more to this, and that is, okay, in that discrimination, there's an element of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of creativity, but there's also two other facets to the individual, at least as I understand it, and that is the moral and responsible facet. And so this brings us across to another point of view. When I say another point of view, it's encapsulated within the concept, within the philosophy of the individual, and that is the moral and responsible facet of the individual. And I'm going to invite Wallace back on the floor to take us further on this. Wallace.
Well, I think that I have been abused myself, because I've had women in the business world come up and put their arm around me, and really that's getting a little too intimate. And furthermore, I had an occasion not too long ago when I made a comment in a store where I happened to be waiting that I usually got into my worst trouble when I opened my mouth. Well, to my absolute astonishment, this woman came right across from the other side of the store and gave me a great big body hug. Well, now, I've been debating whether or not I should report her. And on the other hand, I'm a little bit reluctant, because I think maybe she had an element of genuine humanity in her. And I don't want to violate that. What should I do?
Yeah, that's it. Very good point. And the fact is that people are insisting on their opportunity for expression as an individual, and even though the group mentality is to set these demarcation lines and cause conflict between the male and female, between the other sexual orientations and whatever, to cause this conflict so that we can't actually find expression. We can't talk. We're too frightened because there's eggshells in front of us, and we've got to just gingerly tread our way through the, what would you call it? The political. It is political. The political minefield of legality that stops us from thinking and being honest and accepting that person in front of us as to who they are. I'm part of this group, therefore, and not only that, you can only use this word to me, you can only do this to me. I'm not talking about defamation, I'm talking about domination, of where an activist can dominate your thought pattern, they can dominate how you speak. They have no trouble dominating you, but if you step slightly out of line, all of a sudden their feelings are all over the place, and there's all this great trauma, and this is completely wrong. Now, we've talked about identifying the individual and the uniqueness of it, and I think it's beautiful. The freedom within that creative spark that's within each individual, and now we're talking about the moral and responsible individual. You have the floor, Betty.
Well, I'd hate to think how many years that I have done my best to correspond with politicians and spread what I consider to be the truths about social credit and Christianity and responsibility, all of that. And what I've noticed over the years is that politicians don't even bother to answer you now. There was a time when, if you went to speak with them personally, they would actually, I look back and I realise, they would say the words that they knew you wanted to hear. What they were going to do about it is a different matter. And as time went on, they didn't even bother to respond to your letters because they were so sure of their position. And I think it now comes back to the individual voter that he and she have got to be responsible for the votes they have cast. And they've got to see that the decisions that they have made in that casting of that vote has borne very bad fruit. And they are going to have to take responsibility for that. And they're going to have to, as Jordan Peterson puts it, clean up their own house, get their own house in order.
That's right, Betty. And I for one, look on the outcome of elections is not a 5-minute affair of going to the polling booth and ticking some boxes, but rather that you have to engage with your politician. You have to interact with them, communicate with them as to your point of view. And if you don't do that, then they are no longer a representative, but rather they're a delegate. And this, in their indifference to you, as an individual in your point of view, I'm a delegate. I have the authority. I've got over the line. I've got somewhere or other through chicanery or whatever, 50% plus one of the votes, and therefore I'm a delegate. I'm not a representative. And this is so very wrong. And it comes back to, as an individual, your vote isn't over at the polling booth. It's only the beginning. And your engagement with your politician has to continue on. That is the moral thing to do, moral and responsible thing to do. You've got to pursue your politician and to ensure that they represent you. Don't abdicate your responsibility. And so this to me is the moral and responsible thing in that. Wallace Klinck, your floor.
Well, I think you have to remember that in our lives, we are literally responsible every moment of our lives. And you can't separate things of this nature. We associate on different levels. We associate on a personal level, a family level, a community level, a upper government level. And if we cannot simply abandon our responsibility in that way. And responsibility is exercised through, as you say, Arnie, communication. And so you can't just elect someone and then say, okay, it's all done. Wait for 4 years or 3 years and see what happens. You have to communicate with them. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to you, and it's not fair to society if you don't take a serious interest in your affairs and express your views as to what policies you prefer.
That's it. Thank you, Wallace. That's very important because the that engagement, as Peterson says, it starts with, where does it start with? Cleaning up your room. It starts with you as an individual acknowledging, well, I'm free, yes. I'm moral, yes, I have to be. Moral and responsible. I can't avoid these things. If I relinquish my freedom and I delegate my authority to the politician, then that becomes unethical because you're obscuring part of your life that is a requirement. And if you avoid that requirement, what you're doing is you're actually handing the responsibility of your decision onto the next generation. And that is that they've got a bigger mess to clean up. They've got a bigger mess. And that's what we're looking at, is we're actually looking at the outworking of generational failure. I put it to you, generational failure, where the some individuals did accept the responsibility, but insufficient, where that has, if you like, depleted the cultural capital over an extended period of time. We've depleted our cultural capital because we have abdicated our responsibility, and that's a moral issue. That's a moral question. Yes, Betty, I'm back to you. I'll see you, Wallace, in a sec. Betty, you've got the floor.
Oh, I wasn't expecting it.
Well, that's okay.
I'm sorry,
No,
I haven't got anything
just hold
to
it there. I'll cut to Wallace because I know he's on top of it. Go, Wallace.
Well, I think Eric once expressed it. If you say you're not interested in politics, don't assume that politics is not interested in you. In other words, you had better take note of the fact that you are going to be affected by the people to whom you have given irresponsible power if you don't bring pressure to bear upon them.
That's right. I agree, Wallace. That's very important. That yes, they will, given the opportunity, they will undo you because was it Sir Edmund Burke? All that's necessary for evil to triumph is that good men do nothing, and it's a maxim. It's a truth. It's a good enough truth for us to put it down as essentially a rule. It's a warning, and that's where we're at. We've been warned. The fruit of these warnings is coming to us. We're seeing it, and the problems of the world are that people of different persuasions. When I say that, their philosophy is different. The postmodernist philosophy or the Marxist philosophy, which is an outworking of that, their philosophy is different, and they are of the view that you matter in motion. There's no spirit, there's no individuality. We'll herd them into groups and we'll control them. And of course, was it last century we saw? I mean, some argue as to whether it was 100 million or 200 million were slaughtered because they were herded into groups and insisted that you're part of this group and we don't like who you are or who that group is, and therefore they slaughtered them, and that's atrocious. Wallace, you've got the floor again.
Well, I think it boils down, to the fact, and we may have discussed it before, that you either assume that there is a natural law, there's some kind of a law that does govern the activities, the functions of the universe, or it's all left in the hands of human beings, and the human beings have to simply design and dictate the rules by which people live. And I think that's an extremely presumptuous position. It is very conceited. It's simply totally unrealistic because none of us voted to come into this world. None of us worked our way into the world. It was something that we were given, and we weren't asked about it. So where did it come from? I think we cannot assume that human beings can devise some kind of an artificial intellectual construct by which everyone should be governed. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, that's right. I agree, Wallace. Thank you very much for that. I'm pretty sure I saw Betty's hand up. So, Betty, I'm going to disappear for a minute, but Betty, I'm going to give you the floor, so don't stop.
Thank you, Arnie. Well, I'm just reminded that I had a phone call not so long ago, and this chap was saying that he thinks that the world has been told about their rights long enough, and it has been overemphasized about their rights. What about their responsibilities? And I think there is a great truth in that. And of course, our movement is called the Australian League of Rights. And in that time when it was first being fought for, it was understood that the socialists, the communists, the feminists, all of these were going to take away the people's rights that had been fought for over centuries. And therefore that's the term that came up, Australian League of Rights. Well, while the Australian League of Rights does its best to promote that you have these rights, it also has the balance of promoting that you are, you may be free and you have rights, but you're also moral and responsible. And it could be that we need to emphasize or bring it back into the balance and talk more about the morality and the responsibility. And of course, Wally, I would like to hear you talk about the natural law, that the younger generation might understand it better. I'm not sure whether Arnie has switched on the system that we can go directly to you. So I better talk a little bit longer. I think this has been recorded, and make that point. I'm thinking of the young. You know, they're very happy to have their right to education, their right to do what they want. They're all of these rights, but they haven't balanced that with their morality and their responsibility. You know, you've got the women who they want the right to control their own body, and well, I don't need to go into the different parts. We only need to think ourselves about that, and we can soon come up with some of these, these issues. But yes, you try it, Wally, and see if it works.
Okay, I'm just going to cut across to Wally. There you go, Wally. Sorry about that.
Well, I think that if people really accepted their responsibilities, there would be far fewer grievances in the world that would justify a lot of the complaints that are being made. And some of the complaints are legitimate, but they don't aim at the proper solution to the problem. As you say, they can be narcissistic or self-centered rather than being really generalized in a sense that takes into consideration the benefit of everyone around them. And I think that, in the case of, you were talking about abortion, I believe, and it's fine to talk about the rights to do what you want to do with your body, or to have rights to administer it, or to have control over your body. But what about the other body? That body is a living being. It is a living being. And it strikes me as really heartless that you could consider taking the life of a child. And in Christian theology, of course, that's one of the worst things you could probably do. But on the other hand, I do understand that because of the way things operate, which we operate under the system of, we call it a mammon, a system of financial accountancy and so on, that violates the principles of natural law and brings into being a situation, social and economic, where people really do have very serious problems with insecurity, fear, and want. And so I can understand how people would panic when faced with a situation that they simply cannot handle from an economic standpoint, or don't believe they can. I can understand that. But I think that the thing to do is to try and to look to the basic cause of these things, not to just make an instantaneous, personal, blind response to a situation. I mean...
Sorry, Wallace, I've just jumped in on that. I appreciate where you're taking us on that, and I think that it's quite important to consider policy based on philosophy. And when a policy is expedient, you may not take into account, or you don't take into account, the only do unto him which you'd have him do unto you. The philosophy gives it to us that you only do to someone else what you'd have that someone else do to you. And I think that's when you talk about expediency, or you talk about the financial system, the pressure that's on the individual, it's to me it's an outworking where, well, hang on, this, as you say, the unborn child, there's a situation there where a decision is going to directly affect them as a human being, as an entirely independent human being, and so someone else's decision, that's just so wrong. So Betty, I'll put it across to you. Sorry about the interruption.
That's all right. I'm just thinking of, again, I guess it's from a woman's point of view, that the law allows the abortion of an unborn child, and yet the same law takes someone to court and charges them with assault or murder or whatever it is when a child is, say, 6 months or 12 months old. That doesn't make sense to me. Either the unborn child's life is just as important as the born child, or what are we thinking of as a people?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Betty. I agree, and I see that Wallace wants to take this further. Wallace.
Well, I look at it this way. From the time of conception, the organism is on a continuum of life. In the initial stages, they're dependent, totally dependent. They become less dependent as time goes. But as we age, we become dependent again. And we become more dependent as we age. At all stages of our life, we're dependent. So, I mean, it seems to me is a real act of sophistry to say that the unborn child is not a living being, is not a meaningful, is not a being deserving consideration of life. I mean, it seems to me pure sophistry and motivated by self-concern, but on the other hand, as I say, people are subjected to completely abnormal pressures in the order that we have, which creates a lot of these things, and they're kept ignorant of a lot of the things they should know. As they say, a society or a nation that wants in knowledge will perish. Well, that only makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm reminded of we present Peterson here as a substantive figure because he's taken our thinking to a deeper level, and he says to us, when you make a decision about something, is it good for you? Is it good for you now? Is it good for you today, tomorrow? Is it good for you in a year's time? Okay. Is it good for your neighbour and your contacts, your friends? Is it good for them today? Is it good for them in a year's time? Is it good for the community in today and then in a year's time? And on the basis of this sort of point of view, you start to look and you realise when you make a decision, the decision has profound effects, and the decision permeates as if it has a life of its own. You actually speak your decision into the air, into the world, and that can affect a lot of people over a long period of time. Not everyone has to be a dictator, a tyrant, to permeate that outworking of that decision. They can be just a you and me, and that outworking is just so important. So I put it to you that those decisions you make are very, very important, and you do well to listen to what Peterson is leading the way on. Wallace.
Well, you know, when you throw a pebble in a pond, there are little waves that go out and out and out. When you do something, the actions that you take have effects that can move very, very far away from you and affect other people. That is why a moral and a loving attitude toward your fellow man is so important. You cannot isolate your individual actions from the effects that they may have, which can be quite far-reaching. They can be psychological effects, they can be emotional effects, they can be material effects. So you really have to be, as you say, responsible.
Yes, thank you, Wallace. Sorry, Wallace, I'm jumped in over the top of you, and I can see that Betty wants to talk. I just want to highlight this symbol here on my chest. It's a triquetra. What you call a triquetra? It's a symbol of the interrelationship of a trinity, of different parts of the Trinity. Now, we talk about free, moral, and responsible, and we talk about biology. We talked about the physical body in a discussion. We talked about the physical body of a child, unborn child. But bear in mind The body is only part of you. There's other parts to you as well, and that's the spirit and the soul. And you've got to consider more than just body when you make decisions. And this is where the moral and responsible comes into it. You're talking deeper, and this is where religion finds its way, because it's philosophy or religion that permeates the soul. It touches parts of you that's not just biology. Betty, the floor.
I was reminded of Peterson in one of his videos mentions that it's only religious language that goes deep enough for questions of evil, as an example. And then I was also reminded of Jeffrey Dobbs's paper on love your enemies. Christians are told to love their enemies. Well, if you're going to love your enemy, you've got to get to know him. You've got to know him as a person, as an individual. And it seems to me that is a commandment that Jordan Peterson has certainly taken to heart.
Yeah.
Because he goes out there to learn about those who are opposing him and wants to discuss things with them. He wants to know them as an individual.
Yeah, I agree with you, Betty. It was one of the lectures he did, and this to me is quite profound as to where this man has gone in order to understand what's actually transpired. At the end of the falling of the Berlin Wall, supposedly the end of Sovietization through Eastern Europe, there was a lot of artifacts from the Soviet Union, at least from the Communist Empire, that were up for grabs, and Jordan purchased a few and he placed them in his home. And the reason why he did that was because he wanted to actually go into the minds of these people who were the leaders of the Soviets and the Communist Chinese, but predominantly the Soviets, I believe, with the artifacts, and in order to understand where they had gone and how they could rationalize the slaughter, not of 1 million, not of 6 million, of 100 million, of 200 million people. It gets to the point where it's just absolute carnage. And these were not strangers. These were not the enemy. This was not a war. This was a sacrifice of people within their own communities. And I see it. I'm looking straight in the eye of myself here. I see it that if you conveniently find something as an untruth, but it's convenient to say it, and you speak it for convenience, that's where the Soviets, as Solzhenitsyn said, we lied. They dobbed in their neighbours. They dobbed in anyone in order to try and advance themselves, because the regime was so rancid with poison, and the poison was lies. The poison was untruth. The poison was where they lost, as I think it was that Nietzsche said, God is dead. They lost God in their thinking, and that's why they went to that place, which really was hell on earth. And it's not a place we need to visit again. And I think it's absolutely vital that we come to grips with what we think is how we outwork that. And if we think God is dead, then abortion is fine. Infanticide is fine. Euthanasia, get the old people, line them up, knock them off. End life at 70. Then why not 60? Why not 50? Why not 40? Why not 30? End life. We're doing it before they're born. Well, why not end life up till the time they're 2 years old? Bugger it. Let's go for 5 years old. There are no boundaries, whereas God sets boundaries. And God says, I look at you, I put a spark of life in you, I put a spark of life in you. It's a divine spark. You are unique, you are creative, you have an opportunity for expression. And sorry for staring at it, but philosophy is so important, what you believe. Wallace, the floor.
Well, you see, Marxism is materialism. We're nothing more than protoplasm. We're just matter in motion. And that really takes the spirit out of man. It removes the spirit because all we are is just matter in motion. And so it is really strange that they put up a pretense of righteousness or a social order which is supposed to achieve some kind of justice when they destroy you, not only physically, but spiritually. I was in the Soviet Union before they fell. It was 1981, and I saw the lack of results that had occurred from that administration. It was for the consumer. It was a desert. The only two books in Moscow were Marxist or communist bookstores, and they were full of communist books. These food stores were so basic. They didn't even have refrigeration. They had ice boxes in 1981. I mean, it was just a desert. And if we went out in the country, you would see such dilapidated looking. I mean, we didn't spend much time on the road, but when we did, you could see such dilapidated, ruined homes and things like that. Obviously, the country had been not brought ahead, but suppressed.
That's right. And I remind our viewers, when we identify Marxism, Marxism is only the outworking of a particular philosophy, dialectical materialism, and it's a totalitarian point of view. It's a totalitarian philosophy, and that means that you're handing power to an entity other than yourself. You're handing power to the state. Now, you've got different labels. Any sort of collectivism, any sort of centralisation, you're handing power to some other entity. And so when we talk about you're free, you're moral, responsible, you hand that power to an entity other than yourself, you become irresponsible. And then you can become very easily, expediently immoral. And then at the same time, you lose your freedom. So these are not small matters. These are weighty matters as to why morality, freedom, responsibility, they go hand in hand. Wallace, you're calling back, and I noticed that I'm guessing that Betty will want to talk, but Wallace, you've got the floor.
Well, yes, I mean, when you simply reduce everything to material, things like that, and you hand power over to other people, you are in fact being irresponsible. And it shows you the importance of individual responsibility. And an individual cannot be responsible unless an individual has freedom, because you can't be responsible if you don't think. And you have to think in order to be responsible. So it's just not, it's not logically consistent to try to institute a system that's based on external authority to the individual without individual responsibility, where power is handed over irresponsibly to other people so that they can exercise it arbitrarily. It's just ruination. I mean, it makes no sense. Ethically nor logically, it just doesn't hold together. The things responsibility is an essential thing, and it has to inhere in the individual. It can't be externalized to some other group. It's got to be within each individual. So when people say, oh, you can't trust individuals, the state has to intervene, to the extent that individuals fail, that is possibly true, but it is not the way to build a civilization. And if you continue in that direction, you will not have a civilization. All you will have is a tyranny.
That's it. I agree, Wallace. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about where we can head in the wrong direction from a philosophical point of view. And you can head to a tyranny. You can lose what you have. You can actually lose your civilization. And that's what we're witnessing. As Rome fell through, wasn't barbarians. It was decadence. It was decadence. It was irresponsibility. I want beer. I want circuses. I don't want to have to think. I just want to have a party and that's not the answer to it. The answer is that each will pick up their cross. As Peterson said, it starts by cleaning your own room. Betty Lukes.
Well, Arnie, I haven't got much more to say because I think we have covered it fairly well. But you mentioned about Roman civilization. What I found interesting was to read in Brooks Adams was the author, in his book The Law of Civilization and Decay. And of course he was dealing with the centralization of power when he pointed out that the time he was writing about, it was the legislators and who were actually bankers who made the laws for the banking system.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, there's your centralization of power.
That's it. That's exactly right. All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to bring this forum to a close. I think we've covered some very good ground, and I will be placing this up on YouTube, and I hope you enjoy it. So, to our guest from Canada, Wallace Klinck, thank you so much for coming.
It was been a pleasure. I've very much enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you. And to Betty Lukes from Adelaide. Thank you, Betty.
Yes, thank you, Arnie, and thank you, Wally. It's just been wonderful to be part of this discussion with you.
No worries. Yes, thank you, guests. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is info@thecrossroads.org. Arnie Lukes signing out for today. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of the coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited till his billy boiled, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.